Well, I'm a little bit nervous when immediately before this we say, "May wisdom come to us this day." Yes, it is on. Because these are my thoughts. I don't claim expertise. I don't want you to think that this is the only way to take things. One of the characteristics of this congregation that we've talked about quite often in the last few weeks is that each of us is entitled to our own views, and we need to grow together, not necessarily following one person's leadership. So, thinking about Jesus, clearing the temple, trashing the temple, causing a riot. 13 years ago, Joan and I went to Ethiopia. Our daughter was adopting an Ethiopian orphan, and we wanted to be there to help her, but we also wanted to see something of this country that she was coming from, some of her heritage. So we traveled around a little. And inevitably, when you're a tourist, it doesn't matter where you go as a tourist, you're going to see churches, especially in Europe. Also in Ethiopia, the churches were a little bit different, though. I can think of very few churches in Europe that go back before the year 1000. A lot of the churches in Ethiopia go back older than that. And unlike European churches, which tend to be long and narrow with somebody up at the front end raised up high and speaking, Ethiopian churches tend to be round. And they took services not only inside the center of the circle, but all around the circle on the outside, where they had paintings on the walls. And I guess as they went around, they took the congregation and they walked around pointing out things in the paintings. The paintings served exactly the same purpose as the stained glass windows in European cathedrals. They were ways of visualizing the stories in the Bible, so that for people who couldn't read the stories, for an illiterate people, you could point to it and say, and this is Jesus doing so-and-so. This is the trial. This is the crucifixion. Here Jesus died. We noticed after a while something about all these paintings. The paintings are themselves over 1,000 years old. They've been protected all this time. Almost without exception, I think only once did we find any paintings that dealt with the life of Jesus. They told the story of his nativity. And then they made a huge leap across 33 years to the last week of his life. To his arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, and then on into his resurrection. That whole middle section was missing. And we thought this was really strange. Surely his life is just as important. And then when we started talking about it, we realized that the Christian church historically has done the same thing. We don't often say creeds here, but if some of you know the Apostles' Creed, there's a line in there which says, "I believe in Jesus Christ, conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried." 33 years just goes like that. From the nativity into the last week. And our Gospels don't do quite that much, but all four Gospels take somewhere between a third and a half of their total space dealing with Jesus' last week. It was the most, as far as they were concerned, it was the most important week, the thing that needed to be recorded. They know it was important because it was right ahead of his trial and crucifixion. When I read those stories, I notice something very different. Up until that point, Jesus did most of his teaching by talking. He gave them the sermon principles of the Sermon on the Mount. He gave them a new commandment I give to you. You shall love others as you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love God, love your neighbor. And he told parables. Again, all four Gospels make it clear. Jesus never taught without telling parables, without telling stories that connected with people's lives. But in that last week, he did something different. He stopped telling parables and he started acting them out. Look at a bit of what happened in that week. It's Passover week. Every male Jew was supposed to go to Jerusalem. So there would be hundreds of pilgrims going through the streets, and they had walked there. And Jesus could have gone in quite unobtrusively, walking with the other pilgrims, but he didn't. He rode in, which elevated him above everybody else and made him noticeable. He drew attention to himself. That's not characteristic of him. He rode a donkey. And the Gospels make the point that a donkey is seen as the beast of peace, the unassuming, the meek creature. Not a prancing warhorse, not a big slobbering camel. A donkey. The donkey itself was an enacted parable. All through his life, Jesus had talked about the value of humility, of putting yourself into a lower position in the hierarchy, of serving others, of helping out, not of getting up to the top. In that last week, instead of talking about it, he did it. He went into the upper room and he took the role of a servant, and he knelt in front of people and he washed their feet. Filthy feet. He couldn't forget that. He had previously talked about coming to a miserable, suffering end, and they didn't believe him. They didn't get it. So what did he do on the last night when he was having dinner with them? He took bread and he broke it and said, "This is what's going to happen to my body." And he took wine and he poured it out. And he said, "This is what's going to happen to my blood." And we still remember that. We still act out that parable when we have communion. And the story for today, he trashed the temple. Let's be clear about, it's always easy to misinterpret things. Let's be clear about what he did not intend. First of all, he wasn't setting out to cure the problem in the temple. He got rid of some of the merchants. He got rid of some of the money lenders. He cleared them out of the temple, and they would be right back again the next day. He wasn't saying this is the end of commerce. He wasn't saying this is the way to get rid of shopping malls. No. It also was not a spontaneous act. It wasn't something, a sudden outrage of anger that erupted that he couldn't stop. He knew exactly what he was doing. Because he'd been to the temple many times before that. He had to be in 33 years as a male Jew. In fact, one of the Gospels said he was there the night before, and he looked around and observed, and then he went out again. So when he went into the temple to clear all that stuff, he knew what he was doing. It was deliberate. And let's also be clear that he was not advocating that we, his followers, use violence to solve problems. because this is the only instance of him using violence for anything. And it's contradictory to what he taught. So what was he trying to do? I think his point was that after 3 years of teaching and all that he was saying about what was expected of his disciples, they still didn't get it. If you read the Gospel of Mark, that's the dominant impression that you would get out of it. The disciples, one time I was working with a group and asked them to read the Gospel of Mark all the way through and come back with their impressions. The guy who commented most the next week was, those disciples were really dumb. They didn't get the message. And so he had to do something to get ideas across that they simply could not forget. They couldn't haggle over what he meant. They couldn't reinterpret his words to suit them. This was going to get locked into their memory. You know, can you imagine maybe going up to the interior IPE and Armstrong and walking in and opening all of the pens so that the cattle and the sheep and the llamas and the chickens and the geese and the ducks and everything else were running wild, loose, all over the place? That's what he did. Can you imagine going into interior savings and going around behind the counters and taking the machines that spit out $20 bills and smashing them so that there are pieces of money all over the floor? That's what he did. There were coins rolling around and people were slipping on them and falling them, and he had a whip and people were ducking and hiding and he was slashing away at them. I bet the disciples were back against the wall expecting a SWAT team to come through the doors any second. There was absolutely no way that they could forget this experience. Now, although it wasn't in the bit that Don read, one of the other stories about clearing the temple says that after he cleared all these people out, he added insult to injury. He invited women and children to come in. He invited the blind and the lame, the crippled, the maimed to come in. And the story says that they sang and danced and played games. Okay, it's kind of like taking the stock exchange on Wall Street and turning it into a daycare center. Total reversal. Okay, the next day, the traders are back again. But for a minute, you can see what he thought the kingdom of heaven might be more like. Because all through his ministry, he reached out to those people, what I call the least and the lowest. The women, the children, people with skin diseases, people who had seizures and fell into the fire, and people who had chronic bleeding that couldn't be stopped. As you did it to the least of these, he said, you did it to me. And the disciples didn't get it. They kept asking who was going to sit beside him when he came into his kingdom. They kept asking who was going to be number one in the church that he was founding. They kept saying, have we got the power to bring down fire from heaven to wipe out a whole village of unbelievers? They didn't get it. And so, to try to get his point across, he acted out a parable. As I said in one of my books, this was his last chance. Whether he knew exactly how the events of that week were going to work out, we don't know, and it doesn't matter. He must have known that when he takes his message that was totally contrary to the society of his time, that when he takes his message right into the home turf of the people in power, he's going to be in trouble. And he knew how they got rid of troublemakers. So he knew that he had limited time. He couldn't go on for another 5 or 10 years teaching in the hope that people would get it. It had to be dramatized now, unforgettably. I think that's what he was doing when he trashed the temple. And I'm wearing this shirt, as you know, because Wednesday was anti-bullying day. And as Jim says, I wonder. I'm quite sure that all of you are opposed to bullying. But there are a lot of bullies who aren't in schools. There are bullies elected to high office, and you know exactly who I'm thinking of. There are bullies who get rid of opposition with cluster bombs and chlorine gas. There are bullies who assume that they have a right to leer at the women in their offices and to pat their bums in the elevator and to make propositions that feel as though they're dirtying the receiver. There are bullies who sit in corporate boardrooms who think that the whole world exists so that they can make use of it and make a profit. And I wonder how many of those bullies you opposed this last week. I wonder how many of you took the risk of telling someone that their casual comment or their slightly off-color joke was not acceptable. I wonder how many of you went into Mountain Equipment to say thank you for taking a stand against the U.S. gun lobby. I wonder how often you pick up the newspaper and look at events and say, you know, that's awful. They should do something about that. Because every time you say they should, you're like the disciples. You haven't got the point. It's not that they should. It's that we should. You should. I should. We need to do something. And that's why I wore pink on Wednesday. And I wonder how many of you did.